The morning Jeremiah Chandler finally decided to auction off his father's ranch was the same morning a woman none of them had ever seen before rode into Dusty Creek, Texas, clutching a tintype photograph to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her heart from falling apart. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Dusty Creek sat along the banks of the Colorado River in a stretch of Texas hill country that God had seen fit to bless with limestone bluffs and live oak trees, and a particular quality of morning light that could make even the hardest man pause and think about something other than cattle prices. The town itself was a proper town by frontier standards: 2 saloons, a general store, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a telegraph office, a land registry, and a livery stable that smelled of hay and horse sweat and the slow, comfortable passage of time. 300 souls called Dusty Creek home, and most of them knew each other's business before they knew their own. Jeremiah Chandler was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled at his temples when it grew too long, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone as the bluffs. He had his mother's eyes, a gray so pale they looked silver when the light hit them just right, and he had inherited from his father, Thomas Chandler, the kind of stubborn dignity that made other men either deeply respect you or go out of their way to cause you trouble. He had spent the last 2 years running the Chandler Ranch alone since Thomas had died of a fever in the winter of 1876, and it had been the 2 hardest years of his life, not because the land was unkind. The Chandler Range was 600 acres of good grazing with a creek that ran clear even in summer, and a house that Thomas had built board by board with his own hands. The hardship was of a different nature. The hardship was that Thomas Chandler had left behind a tangle of debts that Jeremiah had only discovered after the funeral, when the bank in Austin had sent a letter that arrived with all the quiet devastation of a bullet. His father, it turned out, had borrowed heavily to finance an expansion of the herd 3 years prior, and then the drought of 1875 had taken a third of the cattle, and Thomas, being the kind of man who never spoke of his difficulties, had said nothing to his son. Jeremiah had spent 2 years trying to work his way out of the debt. He had taken on extra hands in the spring and driven a successful cattle drive in the summer of 1877. He had sold parcels of equipment he could barely afford to be without. He had eaten beans and salt pork for months at a stretch and worn his boots until the soles were held on with wire. And still, the bank's interest was a slow tide that rose around his ankles, and now it had risen to his chest, and he could no longer pretend he was standing on solid ground. The auction had been his own decision, made after a long conversation with Harding at the First Bank of Austin, and an even longer conversation with himself out on the porch in the dark. He would sell the ranch as a going concern, the land, the house, the remaining herd, the equipment, and use the proceeds to settle the debt and start fresh somewhere. Maybe further west, maybe New Mexico territory, where land was cheap and a man without a history might find it easier to build something new. He had told himself he felt nothing about it. He was a practical man, and practical men did not mourn property. But when he walked through the house the morning of the auction, running his hand along the timber frame of the doorway his father had planed smooth on a summer afternoon in 1861, he felt the grief sitting in his chest like a stone. He had hired Walt Prout to run the auction. Walt was a short, energetic man who wore a tall hat to compensate and had a voice that could carry clear across a field of longhorns in a windstorm. Walt had been the auctioneer at every significant sale in the county for 15 years, and he knew how to build a crowd's excitement to a fever pitch. He had set up his platform on the flat ground in front of the barn by 8 in the morning, and by 9, the yard was full of men who had come from as far as Kerrville and Fredericksburg to bid on what was widely acknowledged to be some of the best ranch land in Gillespie County. Jeremiah stood apart from the crowd, leaning against the fence post at the edge of the property, his hat pulled low, and his arms crossed over his chest. He watched the bidders mill around and examine the cattle in the corral and pace off the dimensions of the barn with practiced eyes, and he told himself again that he felt nothing. He was lying to himself, and the morning light knew it, and the old live oak at the corner of the yard knew it, and even the dog, a brown shepherd mix named Copperhead who had been Thomas Chandler's dog first, knew it, because Copperhead sat at Jeremiah's feet and pressed his warm flank against Jeremiah's leg and did not move. That was when he saw her. She rode in on a gray mare that had seen better days but was still sound, a woman dressed in black who held herself very straight in the saddle despite the exhaustion that was evident in every line of her body. She was perhaps 28 or 29 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned tightly beneath a black bonnet, and a face that would have been conventionally pretty if it had not been marked so clearly by grief and determination in equal measure. She rode directly to the edge of the crowd and dismounted with the careful economy of movement that comes from long travel, and then she stood beside her horse and looked at the yard and the platform and the crowd of bidders, and something in her expression shifted, became tight and urgent, and she pressed one hand against the front of her coat as if checking that something was still there. Jeremiah noticed her because she was a woman alone at a cattle auction, which was unusual, and because she was dressed entirely in mourning, which made a man's eye catch and hold. He watched her from his fence post and thought she looked like someone who had come a very long way for a very specific purpose. He was right. Theodora Leland had been traveling for 4 days, from San Antonio north through the hill country, sleeping 2 of those nights in her saddle and 1 night in a boarding house in comfort, where she had spent the last of the money she had kept in her shoe. She had money in her pocket, not much, but enough for what she intended, and she had the tintype photograph in her coat, and she had a story to tell, if only she could find the right person to tell it to. She had been a widow for 8 months. Her husband, Calvin Leland, had died in February of 1878, leaving her with a small house in San Antonio, a 7-year-old daughter named Pearl, and a debt of his own that had consumed the house and most of what little remained within 3 months of his passing. Calvin had been a decent man with a weakness for speculative investment, and his last speculation, a mining venture that had seemed promising and proved disastrous, had taken everything. Theodora had found the photograph while sorting through Calvin's papers after the lawyers had finished with the house. It was in a leather-bound journal, tucked between pages that described, in Calvin's careful handwriting, a business arrangement he had entered into with a man named Thomas Chandler of Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1874. The arrangement had been a loan. Calvin had lent Thomas Chandler $300 to help him recover from a difficult season, and Thomas had given Calvin a promissory note in return, along with the photograph as a gesture of good faith and friendship. The note promised repayment within 3 years with interest. Thomas Chandler had died before the note came due, and Calvin Leland had died without ever collecting on it, but the note was still valid. Theodora had shown it to a lawyer in San Antonio, a thin man named Garrett who wore spectacles and spoke very precisely, and he had told her that the note was a legal obligation of the Chandler estate, and that if there were assets being sold from that estate, she had a right to present the note and make a claim against the proceeds before distribution. $300 plus 4 years of interest at the agreed rate of 6% was $372. To a woman who had spent 3 nights calculating how to feed herself and her daughter through the winter, $372 was an enormous sum. It was the difference between surviving and not surviving. It was the reason she had borrowed the gray mare from her neighbor Mrs. Hutchins and ridden 4 days through the Texas hill country, with Pearl staying behind with Mrs. Hutchins' family. She did not know what she would find in Dusty Creek. She did not know if the Chandler heirs would be reasonable people or difficult ones. She only knew that she had a legal document and a photograph and a daughter to feed, and that those 3 things together were enough to make her ride. Walt Prout was climbing up onto his platform, adjusting his tall hat and shuffling his papers, preparing to call the crowd to order. The bidders were drifting into a rough semicircle before him, hats in hand or pushed back on their heads, chins lifted with the particular alertness of men who are about to spend money and want everyone to know they are capable of it. Theodora moved through the edge of the crowd, trying to find someone in authority. She stopped a young man with a deputy sheriff's badge pinned to his vest and asked him where she might find the heir of the Chandler estate. The deputy pointed across the yard at the man leaning against the fence post with the brown dog at his feet. "That be Jeremiah Chandler," he said. "He owns all of it, or did until today." She looked across the yard at Jeremiah Chandler. He was looking at Walt Prout on the platform. His face was still and hard in the way that faces get when a man is holding himself very carefully together. She took the photograph out of her coat and held it in both hands and walked toward him. Jeremiah saw her coming when she was 20 yards away, and he straightened slightly from his lean against the fence post, because something in the way she moved, direct, purposeful, but also somehow braced against an impact she was expecting, caught his attention and held it. She stopped in front of him and looked up at him with eyes that were a deep, clear brown, steady and tired, and something else beneath those things, something that took him a moment to identify as courage of the particular kind that costs a person something to maintain. "Mr. Chandler," she said. Her voice was low and even, a good voice, the kind that did not waver even when the person using it wanted to. "My name is Theodora Leland. I have come from San Antonio. I believe I had business with your father, and I believe that business is now yours to settle." She held out the photograph. It was a tintype of Thomas Chandler in his prime, perhaps 50 years old, square-jawed and serious in the manner that men adopted for photographs, but with something of warmth in the set of his eyes that the silver image could not quite suppress. It was unmistakably his father. The photograph had sat on the mantelpiece of this house for years before Thomas had, apparently, given it away. Jeremiah took it from her hands. He turned it over. On the back, in his father's handwriting, were the words, "Given in friendship to Calvin Leland, spring of 1874. Thomas R. Chandler." Jeremiah stared at his father's handwriting for a long moment. Something shifted in him. Not the grief that was always there, it had become part of the landscape of his interior life, but something adjacent to it, something that felt like the first tentative movement of a door that has been closed so long you have forgotten it could open. "How did you come by this?" he asked. "It was among my husband's papers," she said. "Calvin Leland. He died in February." She said it quietly, without self-pity, the way people say true things that are simply true. "He had a promissory note from your father, signed in 1874. $300 at 6%, due within 3 years. The note is still valid, Mr. Chandler. I had it examined by a lawyer." Jeremiah looked up from the photograph and looked at her. Walt Prout had begun his warm-up patter on the platform, working the crowd, building toward the opening of the bidding. The noise was rising around them. "Ma'am," he said, "this auction is about to begin." "I know that," she said. "That is why I rode 4 days to be here." He looked at her for another moment. There were the beginnings of dark circles under her eyes. Her black dress was travel-worn, and there was dust on her boots that went all the way up to the ankle. She had come 4 days on horseback in morning clothes because she had a piece of paper and a photograph and enough determination to make the ride. Jeremiah turned and put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled, sharp and carrying, at Walt Prout. Walt stopped mid-sentence and looked at him. The crowd turned. Jeremiah held up one hand, palm out, in the unmistakable gesture of hold. Walt stared at him. "Chandler," he said, with the tone of a man who has spent 15 years staging auctions and has never had a client stop the proceedings before they started. "What in the—" "Hold the bidding," Jeremiah said, loudly enough that the crowd heard it clearly. "There is a prior matter to address." The murmur that went through the assembled bidders was the sound of 100 calculations being interrupted. Men who had driven from Careville and Fredericksburg shifted on their feet and exchanged looks. The deputy with the badge looked curious. Copperhead the dog sat very still. Theodora Leland, who had been braced for a fight, who had rehearsed arguments all the way from San Antonio for every variety of dismissal and hostility she might encounter, looked at Jeremiah Chandler with an expression that was startled and careful at the same time, as if she was not sure whether to be relieved or wary of relief. He turned back to her. "Come inside," he said. "We will talk this through properly. Walt can wait." "Your bidders, they will wait too," he said. "They drove from Careville for Good Cattle Land. Good Cattle Land will still be here in half an hour." He gestured toward the house, and after a moment she nodded and walked beside him across the yard, through the gate, and up the porch steps. Inside, the house smelled of pine and wood smoke, and the particular absence of a woman's presence, that slightly spare quality that a bachelor's house acquires over time even when it is clean. The front room had a stone fireplace with an empty mantelpiece. He noticed her eyes go to it, and he knew she had recognized that the mantelpiece was where the photograph had once stood. He set the photograph on the mantelpiece and then turned to face her. "Let me see the note," he said. She reached into the front of her coat and brought out a folded piece of paper that had been carried carefully enough that its edges were still crisp despite the journey. She unfolded it and held it out. He read it carefully. It was his father's handwriting throughout, spelling out the terms with the methodical precision of a man who had taught himself to read and write as an adult, and had always treated written words with a respect that bordered on reverence. The date was April of 1874. The amount was $300. The terms were clear. Thomas R. Chandler's signature was at the bottom, firm and recognizable. Jeremiah looked at the note for a long time. His father had borrowed money from Calvin Leland in 1874. Thomas Chandler had never mentioned it to his son. He had carried that private debt the same way he had carried all his private debts, quietly and alone, and then he had died with it unresolved. "He never told me," Jeremiah said. "My husband never mentioned it to me either," Theodora said. "I only found it after." She paused. "I am sorry about your father. I never knew him, but from what Calvin wrote of him in his journal, he was a man worth knowing." Jeremiah looked up from the note. "What did your husband write of him?" She seemed slightly surprised by the question. "He wrote that your father was an honest man," she said. "That when the drought hit and the money was hard to come by, your father came to him directly and explained the situation plainly, without making excuses or embellishments. Calvin wrote that it was the most dignified request for assistance he had ever received. He considered it a privilege to be able to help." She paused again, and something moved across her face, something private and slightly painful, perhaps the comparison between that dignity and other memories she carried. He gave the money gladly. Jeremiah set the note down on the table between them. "The figure with interest," he said. $372, she said, and there was nothing apologetic in how she said it, which he respected. She was not pretending the money was irrelevant. She was not softening the demand. She needed it, and she had a right to it, and she said so plainly. "I can settle it," he said. "The auction proceeds will be more than sufficient. You will be paid in full before anything else is distributed, Mrs. Leland. I will have Walt Prout note it formally in the auction records." She looked at him steadily. Something in her expression loosened, not dramatically. She was not a dramatic person. He was already beginning to sense that, but perceptibly, like a muscle unclenching. "Thank you," she said. "I did not know what I would find here. I was prepared for an argument." "You had the right of it," he said simply. "My father made a promise. I will keep it." She nodded. There was a brief silence in the room, the comfortable kind rather than the awkward kind. Outside, the sounds of the crowd filtered through the walls, the low, steady noise of men waiting and horses shifting and the distant lowing of the cattle in the corral. Then she said, "May I ask, why are you selling?" He looked at her. It was a personal question. She asked it directly, without apology, the same way she had stated the debt. He found he did not mind. "He left debt," Jeremiah said. "More than I knew. I have been working it down for 2 years and I am still short of the end of it." He said it without shame in the same plain way she had spoken. "The land will sell well. It is good land." "It is," she said. She was looking out the window at the view, the limestone bluffs catching the morning light, the live oaks, the clear stretch of the creek visible through the trees. "It is very good land." He looked at her looking at it, and for no reason he could have explained, something in his chest moved. "Where will you go after?" she asked. "West," he said. "I have not decided further than that." She nodded slowly. "I understand the feeling," she said. And from the way she said it, he believed she did. He picked up the note and the photograph from the table and the mantelpiece respectively and held them out to her. "You will want these back," he said. "The note as your receipt and the photograph," as he paused, "as your own." She took the note, but she looked at the photograph for a moment without taking it. "It belongs here," she said, "in this house, at least until today." He set it back on the mantelpiece. She looked at it once more, and then she looked at him, and she said, "I should let you get back to your auction, Mr. Chandler. I am sorry to have delayed it." "Don't be," he said. "I was in no hurry to start it." They walked back out onto the porch together, and the light hit them full in the face, warm and golden, and Walt Prout looked up from his platform with an expression of vast professional relief, and adjusted his hat, and prepared to resume. Theodora shook Jeremiah's hand at the porch steps, the firm, businesslike handshake of a woman who had learned that women must conduct themselves like men if they wish to be taken seriously in commercial matters. His hand was large and warm and calloused in the particular places that come from years of fence work and rope handling. She had small hands, still soft despite everything, and the contrast was pronounced. She stepped back and began walking toward her horse. He watched her go. Something about the straightness of her back and the slight weariness in the set of her shoulders and the black dress, and the 4 days of dust on her boots struck him in a place he had not felt struck in a very long time. He did not examine the feeling. He only watched. Walt Prout called the opening of the bidding, and the crowd came back to life, and Jeremiah Chandler forced himself to turn around and pay attention to the dismantling of everything he had grown up knowing. The auction lasted 3 hours. It was, by every measurable standard, a success. The land went to a ranching consortium from Fredericksburg for a price above the reserve Jeremiah had set. The cattle went to a buyer from Careville, who had the red-faced competitive look of a man who would not be outbid if it killed him. The equipment went in pieces to various buyers, and even Copperhead's feed supply went to the family from the neighboring homestead, who had long admired the efficiency of Thomas Chandler's barn setup. When it was finished and Walt Prout had recorded the final figures, and the hands had started moving cattle toward their new owner's wagons, Jeremiah stood in the middle of the yard with a figure in his pocket that was, for the first time in 2 years, enough to clear the debt and leave something over. Not much, but something. He had his account ledger laid on the tailgate of his wagon, and he was working through the distributions when he looked up and saw that Theodora Leland was still there. She was sitting on a fence rail at the far end of the yard, her horse tied beside her, and she was watching the cattle be driven out through the gate with an expression he could not read from this distance. He walked over. She heard him coming and looked at him. Up close, she looked even more tired than she had that morning, and he realized the particular quality of her exhaustion was not just from the 4-day ride, but from something longer and more total than that. The exhaustion of a woman who has been holding herself together under sustained pressure for a very long time. "I can pay you today," he said. "If you want to wait while I go to the bank with Prout, I can have the funds in your hand by this afternoon." "I appreciate that," she said. "Yes, I will wait." He hesitated. Then he said, "Have you eaten today?" She paused just a fraction too long before saying, "I am fine." He looked at her steadily. "That is not what I asked." Something in her composure shifted, a small, involuntary thing. "No," she said after a moment. "I have not." "There is a restaurant on Main Street," he said. "Mrs. Hooper's. It is decent. I would be glad of the company if you are willing." He said it carefully, in the tone of a man who is extending a genuine invitation without any intent to make it more than it is, and who wants the recipient to feel entirely free to decline. She looked at him for a moment with those steady brown eyes. Then she said, "All right." They walked to Mrs. Hooper's on Main Street together, the horse tied at the post outside, and they sat across from each other at a table by the window, with the fall afternoon light coming in gold and long across the tablecloth. And they ordered the roast beef and cornbread that Mrs. Hooper was known for, and they talked. They talked the way people talk when they are both lonely and have not admitted it even to themselves. They talked about Texas in the fall, about the quality of the light, and the way the cedar smelled after rain. Theodora talked about San Antonio with a warmth that was mixed with the complicated sadness of a place that had become too difficult. He asked about Pearl, her daughter, and her face changed when she spoke of the child, opened up, became luminous with a love that was uncomplicated in a way that everything else in her life at this moment was not. "She is 7, she said. "She has her father's stubbornness, and God help her, my tendency to ask too many questions. She asked me before I left why I was going. I told her Mama had a paper that needed delivering, and she said that papers could be mailed and couldn't she come with me. She smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and it was a remarkable thing. It changed the entire geometry of her face, brought warmth flooding into every line of it. I told her it was too far. She said that distances don't care about children's comfort or mother's nerves, which is either a very wise thing or a very impertinent thing for a 7-year-old to say. "Probably both," he said. "Probably both," she agreed. He talked about his father. Not about the debt or the auction, but about Thomas Chandler as a man, how he had built the house, how he had taught Jeremiah to read the weather from the color of the dawn sky, how on Sunday mornings in summer he had sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and read aloud from the Bible, not because he was particularly religious, but because he loved the language of it, the rise and fall of the sentences. "He sounds like someone I would have liked to know," Theodora said. "He was not always easy," Jeremiah said. "He had a temper, and he kept things to himself that he should have shared. The debt was not the first surprise he left behind, only the largest." He said it without bitterness, which was harder than it sounded. "But he was a good man, the best I have known." She nodded, understanding the particular complexity of grieving someone who was good and flawed in equal measure. "Calvin was like that too," she said quietly. "A good man who kept things to himself until keeping them became their own kind of damage." She looked down at her plate for a moment. "I miss him. And I am also, very quietly, angry with him for the situation he left us in. And then I feel guilty for the anger because he did not intend it." She looked up. "Is that a terrible thing to say?" "No," he said. "It is an honest thing to say. Terrible things don't usually sound that honest." She looked at him with something new in her expression, a kind of relief, the specific relief of being understood rather than merely sympathized with. After lunch, they went to the bank, where Harding the banker counted out $372 in currency, and Theodora signed a receipt for it in handwriting that was neat and small and confident, and tucked the money into a flat wallet inside her coat, with the careful precision of a woman who has learned not to take security for granted. Outside the bank, on the wooden sidewalk with the afternoon sun throwing long shadows and the smell of horse and dust and autumn in the air, they stood facing each other in the slightly awkward way of people who have had a better time together than they were expecting and are not sure what happens now. "I should be getting back," she said. "I need to reach the boarding house in comfort before full dark." "You are riding back tonight," he frowned. "That is 20 miles. "I know how far it is," she said, and there was a mild reproof in it that made him straighten slightly and acknowledge that she was, in fact, an adult who had managed 4 days of solo travel and did not need him to question her logistics. "Of course," he said. He stopped. He tried again. "I hope the ride is easier than the one coming in." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Chandler, for what you did today. For stopping the auction and talking to me properly and keeping your father's word." She paused. "Not everyone would have done that. "My father would have expected it," he said, "and so would I of myself." She extended her hand again. He took it. The handshake lasted a moment longer than the one this morning had. Neither of them moved to end it immediately. Then she stepped back, untied the gray mare, and mounted with the ease of long practice. She settled in the saddle and looked down at him from the elevation of the horse's back. "I wish you luck in the West, Mr. Chandler," she said. "I hope you find something good." "I hope the same for you, Mrs. Leland," he said. She turned the horse and rode south down Main Street, and Jeremiah stood on the sidewalk and watched her go until she was around the bend and out of sight, and then he stood there for another few seconds, not quite ready to stop. He drove back to the ranch in the early evening. The house was empty and echoing in the way of houses that have just had their contents diminished. The mantelpiece was empty. He had given the photograph to the man from the Fredericksburg Consortium when he handed over the deed, thinking it properly belonged to the property. Now he regretted that. He stood in front of the empty mantelpiece and looked at the blank stone shelf, and for the first time since the idea of the auction had come to him, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what this day had cost. He slept badly that night. In the morning he told himself it was the strangeness of the situation, the loss of the house, the adjustment he would need to make. He made coffee and drank it standing on the porch looking at the live oaks and the limestone bluffs and the creek, which he could still see through the trees because the leaves had not yet fully turned. He told himself he was thinking about the West, about New Mexico territory and fresh starts. He was thinking about a woman in black with auburn hair and steady brown eyes who asked questions without apology and smiled only when she meant it, and had ridden 4 days alone through hill country to keep her daughter fed. 3 days passed. He stayed in the house while he organized the transfer of the property and settled his accounts and packed the things he would take with him into the West. Not much. A man traveling light travels better, and he had always been a practical packer. He paid off his men, every one of them, the full amounts he owed plus a small bonus from the surplus, because Thomas Chandler had always said that a man who shortchanged his workers was a man who had already begun to rot from the inside. On the 4th day he found himself in the bank talking to Harding about the best route through the hill country going west, and Harding mentioned, in the way that small-town bankers always know things they have no business knowing, that the widow Leland had been a San Antonio woman, and San Antonio was a fine city. Had Jeremiah ever spent time there? Jeremiah had spent 6 days in San Antonio in 1872 on his way to drive cattle north, and had found it large and noisy and somewhat overwhelming. He said so. Harding said San Antonio had calmed down considerably since the early 70s, with the railroad coming through and making it a more settled sort of place, and that a man with a fresh stake and some ambition might do very well there. That evening, Jeremiah sat on the porch of the house that no longer belonged to him, in the last light of an October afternoon, and had a very direct conversation with himself. He was a practical man. He was not a man who acted on impulse or sentiment. He had not built, and then worked to preserve everything he had by making decisions based on the vague pull of feeling. Everything he had done in his life had been deliberate and considered, including the decision to sell this ranch, which had been the hardest deliberate and considered decision he had ever made. But he was also, at 34 years old, a man who had been alone for a very long time in the deep sense of the word, not just without a wife, but without the particular kind of company that only comes from someone who genuinely sees you. He had been seen in the space of one afternoon at Mrs. Hooper's restaurant by a woman who was too tired and too honest and too full of grace to pretend. He was going west. He had decided that. But west was a direction, not a destination, and a man choosing a direction could choose his course with some degree of flexibility. He went inside and wrote a letter. He addressed it to Mrs. Theodora Leland, care of General Delivery, San Antonio, Texas, and he wrote it with the careful precision of a man who is trying to say something true without saying more than he is certain of. The letter said, "Mrs. Leland, I find that I am not certain of my route west and have been given to understand that San Antonio is a city a man might reasonably make a stop in before continuing. I have been told there are decent stockyards and that the cattle market is developing in favorable ways, and I have some interest in this from a professional standpoint. I write to ask whether you would find it an imposition if I called on you during such a stop, in whatever capacity would be appropriate and comfortable to you. I think of our conversation at Mrs. Hooper's with some frequency, and find it was the best conversation I have had in a considerable time. If this is forward of me, please disregard it. If it is not, please write to me at General Delivery, Dusty Creek, before the 15th of this month, as I expect to depart by that date. With respect and regard, Jeremiah Chandler." He sealed it and wrote it to the post office the next morning and handed it to the postmaster, and then he went back to the ranch and tried very hard not to think about it. He had 9 days until the 15th. He packed. He sold his saddle horse and bought a better one from a man in Careville. He arranged for Copperhead to go to the family from the neighboring homestead who had, it turned out, been hoping to acquire the dog as much as the feed supply. He stood in the yard of the house he had grown up in one last time and looked at it for a long time, committing it to memory. The reply came on the 12th day. It was in handwriting that was neat and small and confident, and it said, "Mr. Chandler, you are not forward. The stockyards here are indeed developing in favorable ways, and I believe you will find San Antonio worth a visit. I am currently residing at the boarding house of Mrs. Clara Bates on Soledad Street, who is a good woman and sets an excellent supper table. Pearl asks me daily when Mama's next errand will take her somewhere interesting, and I have had to explain that errands are not adventures, though in this particular case I am beginning to doubt my own distinction. Come when you are ready. We will be here. Theodora Leland." He read the letter 3 times. He folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket and started saddling his horse. He rode into San Antonio on a Tuesday morning in late October of 1878, when the air had that quality of early autumn that makes cities look their best, golden and clear and smelling of things burning pleasantly in fireplaces. The city was larger than he remembered and considerably more settled, with brick buildings going up along several of the main streets, and a busy thoroughfare of wagons and riders, and the new electric streetcar, which he had heard about but never seen, moving quietly along its track in a way that seemed slightly miraculous to a man fresh in from the hill country. He found Mrs. Bates's boarding house on Soledad Street without much difficulty. It was a white-painted adobe building with a red geranium in a pot beside the door, and a sign in neat letters advertising clean rooms and good meals. He tied his horse at the post and knocked. Mrs. Bates was a small, rounded woman of 60 with sharp eyes that assessed him with the particular thoroughness of a boarding-house landlady who has spent decades reading the characters of strangers. She appeared satisfied with what she read. "Mrs. Leland is in the parlor," she said. "She has been expecting you." The parlor was a comfortable room with 2 upholstered chairs, and a horsehair sofa, and afternoon light coming in through lace curtains. Theodora was sitting in one of the chairs with a piece of mending in her hands, and beside her, cross-legged on the braided rug, was a child of about 7 with dark auburn hair the same shade as her mother's and a very direct gaze. Theodora looked up when he came in and put the mending aside and stood, and she was not wearing black today. She was wearing a dark green dress that was simple and well made, and the color made the auburn of her hair more pronounced, and she looked rested in a way she had not looked in Dusty Creek, as if the 8 days between their meetings had allowed her to put down some of the weight she had been carrying. "Mr. Chandler," she said, "you came." "I said I would," he said. She smiled. It was the same smile he remembered, the one that changed the entire geometry of her face. "This is Pearl," she said, gesturing at the child on the rug. Pearl looked up at him with her mother's directness and said without preamble, "Mama says you sold your ranch. Didn't you like it?" "Pearl," Theodora said, in the tone that indicates the exact boundary between a child's acceptable directness and actual impertinence. "I liked it very much," Jeremiah said, crouching down to the child's level in the way that comes naturally to men who have spent time around young animals and know that diminishing yourself to their size is the right first move. But sometimes a thing you love stops working the way it needs to and you have to make a change. Pearl considered this with the grave seriousness of 7. "Like when Mama's house in the other part of the city stopped being our house," she said. "Yes," he said, "something like that." Pearl seemed to find this satisfactory. "Do you have a dog?" she asked. "I did," he said. "His name was Copperhead. I gave him to good people before I left." "That was the right thing to do," Pearl said. "Dogs need to stay in one place." "They do," he agreed. He looked up and found Theodora watching him with the careful expression she seemed to use when she was revising her understanding of something. He stood up. "Mrs. Bates says supper is at 6, Theodora said. "You are welcome to join us if you like. I should warn you that Mrs. Bates asks a great many questions during supper, and that Pearl has been known to answer for adults who are taking too long." "That sounds like supper worth attending," he said. It was. Mrs. Bates did ask a great many questions, and they were the right kind of questions, interested and direct without being intrusive, and Jeremiah answered them honestly, and found that being honest about his situation, about the debt and the auction and the plan to go west, felt better when said aloud in a room with good light and decent company. Pearl, true to her mother's warning, did answer for him twice when she felt he was insufficiently clear, and both times her answers were, in fact, accurate. Over the following 2 weeks, Jeremiah took a room at a different boarding house 2 streets over, and found himself spending most of his time on Soledad Street. He and Theodora walked through the city in the mornings, along the bend of the river where the cypress trees overhung the water, and in the afternoons he helped Pearl with her arithmetic at the table in the parlor because Pearl's arithmetic was, in Pearl's own frank assessment, a disaster, and in the evenings the 3 of them sat in Mrs. Bates's parlor and he and Theodora talked while Pearl drew pictures in her copybook with a look of intense concentration. He did not say what he was feeling. He was a deliberate man, and he did not intend to make declarations before he was certain they were right, and before the ground was solid enough to support them. But the feeling itself was not something he could manage or contain. It was there the way certain truths are there, quietly and completely, as obvious as the quality of the light in the morning. He was falling in love with Theodora Leland. He had been, he suspected, falling in love with her since she walked across a crowded ranch yard with a photograph clutched to her chest and looked at him with those steady brown eyes and stated her case without fear or apology. What he did not know was whether she was falling in love with him. She was warm with him, but she was warm with people generally, with Mrs. Bates, with the woman at the market stand on Commerce Street, with the neighbors whose children Pearl had begun to befriend. She was easy with him in conversation, easy enough that the ease itself might mean nothing beyond ordinary friendship. She laughed at things he said, but she was not a woman who laughed easily to flatter anyone, so the laughter was real, which meant something. But what it meant exactly he could not be certain. He also knew that she was still in mourning, or near enough to it, and that 8 months was not a long time, and that he had no wish to rush past her feelings or her grief or her need to make her own decisions without pressure. So he was patient. He went about the city and made inquiries about the cattle market and the stockyards, because he was not lying when he had written to her about that. The San Antonio market was genuinely developing in ways that interested him, and he began to think that his path west might have an extended stop of indeterminate length. He looked at parcels of land in the area with a cattle buyer named Moss who had a forthright manner and knew the market well. He began to sketch, in the back of a ledger, the rough outlines of what a modest ranching operation in the area south of the city might look like. He was not making plans. He told himself he was exploring options. But the options all seemed to involve staying near San Antonio. The conversation that changed things came on a Thursday evening in mid-November, when Pearl had gone to bed and Mrs. Bates had retired with her knitting, and he and Theodora were sitting in the parlor with the lamp between them and the fire going steadily in the grate, and outside the city made its quiet night sounds. Theodora had been reading, or trying to. Her book was in her lap, but she had not turned a page in 20 minutes. He had been aware of a quality of preoccupation in her that had been building for a few days, something she was working toward, some interior conversation reaching its conclusion. She set the book aside and looked at him. "Jeremiah," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He felt it like a small, significant key turning in a lock. "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly because I am not built for indirect conversations about things that matter." "I know that about you," he said. "Ask." She looked at him steadily. "Why are you still here? You came to look at the stockyards and you have looked at them. You came to think about going west and you have had 6 weeks to think about it. You are a man of purpose and you do not drift. So why are you still here?" He looked at her. The fire made small, warm sounds. The lamplight was steady and kind. "You know why," he said. "I think I know why," she said. "But I need to hear it said because I have a daughter to think about, and I have made enough decisions based on what I hoped was true rather than what was actually said, and I will not do that again." He understood what she was asking and why, and he respected it so thoroughly that it made the answer easier to say. "I am here because I am in love with you," he said. "I have been since approximately the moment you walked across my ranch yard and told me calmly that you had ridden 4 days through hill country because you had a piece of paper and a right, and neither the distance nor the uncertainty of your reception had been enough to stop you. That is the kind of woman a man does not forget. I have tried, because I knew your situation was complicated and mine was uncertain, but I have been unsuccessful." He paused. "I am not asking you for anything tonight that you are not ready to give. I only want you to know that it is true." Theodora was quiet for a moment. Not in the silence of a woman who is unmoved, but in the silence of a woman who has been moved enough that she needs a moment to find her words. "I am still grieving," she said. "Not every day and not with the same weight as 3 months ago, but still." "I know that," he said. "And Pearl is not, she does not need confusion. She needs certainty." "I understand that too," he said. "I am not asking for a decision tonight. I am only telling you the truth so that you have it and can do with it what you choose." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I am going to tell you something true in return." She looked at him steadily. "I think I have been falling in love with you since Mrs. Hooper's restaurant when you said that terrible things don't usually sound as honest as what I was saying. Because no one had ever said something that exact and right to me about my own thoughts, and I did not expect it, and it unbalanced me in a way that nothing has unbalanced me in a very long time." He looked at her. The fire moved. The lamp was steady. "But I need time," she said. "Not forever, not even very long, but time." "Take as much as you need," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she smiled, the full version of the smile, the one that changed everything, and she said, "Thank you, Jeremiah." They stayed in the parlor another hour, talking of simpler things, and when he said good night and walked back to his boarding house in the cool November dark, he found that he was not impatient. The patience was not a performance or an exercise of will. It was the genuine ease of a man who has said what is true and heard what is true in return, and who can wait because waiting is no longer the same as not knowing. December came, and with it the particular quality of a Texas winter, which is not severe by the standards of other places, but has a bite to it nonetheless. A cold that comes off the plains and makes the cedar smoke of 1,000 fires smell clean and sharp in the air. Pearl discovered a passion for birdwatching, which she pursued with the same intensity she brought to everything. And Jeremiah found himself spending Sunday afternoons in the cedar brake south of the city with Pearl on his shoulders, so she could see over the brush, and a field guide to birds of Texas in his pocket that he had found at the bookshop on Commerce Street. Theodora walked beside him on these afternoons, and they talked, and the talking continued to have the quality it had always had between them, honest and easy, and ranging across things both large and small. The way conversation goes between people who have discovered they are genuinely interested in each other's minds. He also spent time alone with Pearl, who had decided that she approved of him with the same directness and totality with which she had initially assessed him. Pearl told him things about her father, good memories, the things a 7-year-old holds on to, and he listened to them with full attention, because they were important to her, and therefore important to him. He did not try to occupy Calvin Leland's place or pretend the man had not existed. He was his own person, and Pearl seemed to understand and appreciate this distinction in the clear-eyed way of a child who has not yet learned to accept things she does not believe to be true. In January of 1879, Jeremiah found the land. It was a parcel of 200 acres south of the city, along a branch of the San Antonio River, with good grass and a stand of live oaks and a modest but well-built house on it that the previous owner had vacated when ill health had driven him to move to Galveston and its milder air. The price was fair for what it was, and the terms the seller offered were favorable. He walked the property twice with the cattle buyer Moss, and once alone in the early morning when the frost was still on the grass and the sun was just coming up over the eastern hills. He bought it. He did not tell Theodora why until the Sunday after the deed was signed, when they were walking in the cedar brake with Pearl ahead of them on the path, following a vermilion flycatcher she had spotted and was convinced she could identify by its call. "I bought land," he said. Theodora looked at him. "Where?" "South of the city, 200 acres along the river, good cattle country." He paused. "I am not going west." She looked at him. The morning light was filtered through the cedar branches and lay in patches on the path, and her breath made small clouds in the cold air, and her eyes were very steady and very warm. "Jeremiah," she said. "I'm not asking you for anything you have not decided to give," he said. "The land is mine regardless. I intend to build something there. I only want you to know that when I chose where to build it, the choosing was not accidental." She looked at him for a long, steady moment. Pearl cried out in triumph from ahead of them on the path. She had located the flycatcher and was reporting its exact position in excited terms. "All right," Theodora said. "All right. All right, I think we need to have a different kind of conversation than the one we have been having," she said. "But perhaps not in a cedar brake on a Sunday morning with Pearl within earshot." "Name the time," he said. "Tomorrow evening," she said. "Mrs. Bates has promised Pearl she can help make biscuits, which will occupy them both until at least 7 o'clock. He felt something warm and certain settle in his chest. "Tomorrow evening," he agreed. That evening, in Mrs. Bates's parlor, with the biscuit-making going on in the kitchen and the smell of flour and wood smoke in the air, Theodora Leland and Jeremiah Chandler sat across from each other and had the conversation they had been gradually moving toward since October. She told him she had loved Calvin and still missed him, and always would in the specific way that the dead stay with the living, but that grief and love were not mutually exclusive, and that a heart that has loved deeply is not made smaller by that love but larger. She told him she trusted him, which was not something she had expected to say to anyone for a long time after Calvin's death. She told him Pearl had informed her with complete confidence that Jeremiah was, in her assessment, a good man, and that Pearl's assessments were, in Theodora's experience, reliable. He told her that he was not a man of many words, and that he had said most of what he needed to say over the previous months, except for one thing he had not said yet, which was that he wanted to marry her. Not because he was uncertain of what he felt, but because he was completely certain, and because a man who is completely certain should say so plainly rather than suggest it through elaborate circumlocution. She said yes. Not immediately. She sat with it for a moment, looking at him with those steady brown eyes that saw things clearly, and then she said yes with the same directness with which she said everything that mattered to her. He reached across the table and took her hand. It was the first deliberate tenderness between them, and it was very simple, and it was, for all its simplicity, the most complete thing he had felt in years. From the kitchen, Pearl's voice could be heard explaining to Mrs. Bates the correct way to cut biscuits, and Mrs. Bates could be heard responding with the patient good humor of a woman who knows that 7-year-olds explaining the correct way to do things is simply the cost of excellent company. They were married in the spring, on a Saturday in April of 1879, in the church on the edge of the city, where the San Antonio River bent south. The ceremony was simple because both of them preferred simplicity, and the attendance was small because they had not been in the city long enough to accumulate large circles of acquaintance. But the small circle that was there was the right kind: Mrs. Bates in her best dress and her eyes very bright, the cattle buyer Moss and his wife, the neighbor family whose children had become Pearl's friends, the deputy from Dusty Creek, who had happened to be in the city on county business and had heard about the marriage and come to offer his congratulations. Pearl was the flower girl and took the role with the intensity of purpose that she brought to all roles, which meant she scattered the flower petals with mathematical precision, and then looked up at Jeremiah as he stood waiting at the front of the church with an expression of complete solemn confidence that made him, very privately, want to laugh with something that was not quite laughter and not quite anything else, but was very close to pure happiness. Theodora walked down the aisle in a dress the color of cream that Mrs. Bates had helped her make in the weeks before the wedding, and when she reached the front and stood beside him and looked up at him, her eyes were bright and steady and full of something that resolved all his remaining uncertainty about everything. The preacher was a man named Brother Solomon, who had the good sense to make the service meaningful without making it lengthy, and who spoke with genuine feeling about the particular quality of love that comes to people who have already known loss and chosen to love again anyway, which he said was not the brave version of love but the braver version, because it is easier to love when you have not yet learned what love's loss costs. When Jeremiah put the ring on Theodora's finger, a narrow gold band that he had bought from the jeweler on Alamo Plaza, and that had taken him 3 visits to choose because he wanted it to be right. Her hand was steady and warm and small in his large one, and he thought briefly of the first handshake in Dusty Creek, the businesslike handshake of a woman presenting her legal case, and the distance between that moment and this one seemed very large and very small at the same time. He kissed her for the first time as her husband in front of the small congregation, and it was the kind of kiss that is brief in duration but enormous in what it contains, and Pearl, standing beside them, said in a carrying whisper to Mrs. Bates, "I thought it was going to be longer than that," which produced a wave of warm laughter from the assembled guests that set the tone for the celebration that followed perfectly. They moved to the property south of the city in May. The house was modest and well built, as Jeremiah had observed when he first walked it, and in the weeks before the move he had done considerable work to make it more comfortable. A new floor in the kitchen, additional shelves in the parlor, a room for Pearl that had a window looking east so she could watch for birds in the morning without leaving her bed. Pearl approved of the bird window with great enthusiasm. She approved of the property generally with the comprehensive thoroughness of a child who has been told this is now her home and has taken that information seriously. She named every significant tree within 50 yards of the house, announced the exact population of the cattle herd that Jeremiah had begun assembling, and informed him that there was a family of mockingbirds nesting in the live oak at the north end of the yard, who had been there longer than anyone and therefore had prior claim, and should be given appropriate respect. He told her he would endeavor to honor the mockingbird's prior claim. The first summer on the property was one of the most complete seasons of Jeremiah's life. He built the herd steadily, learning the San Antonio market with the same methodical intelligence he had always brought to cattle, and found that Moss had been right. There was money to be made here for a man who knew the business. Theodora managed the domestic side of the property with the same unsentimental competence she brought to everything, and also, within the first 3 months, had identified herself to the neighboring homesteaders as a woman who could be counted on, which in frontier communities was a currency more valuable than most others. She helped Mrs. Alvarado when Mrs. Alvarado's baby came early and the midwife was delayed. She organized, with Mrs. Bates, who drove out from the city for the purpose, a subscription to bring books to the farming families in the area whose children had limited access to education. She sat with old Mr. Delaney when he was dying in September and had no one nearby, holding his hand and reading to him from the Bible in her steady, carrying voice, the rise and fall of the sentences. Jeremiah watched all of this with something that had no simple name. He was proud of her in the way that goes beyond pride, which is to say, he was not proud of her as a possession or an accomplishment, but in the way that a person is moved by something beautiful and true that exists completely independently of them. He also fell in love with her, continuously and in new ways, as the first summer revealed the full texture of who she was. He fell in love with the way she laughed, which was sudden and genuine, and sometimes surprised even her. He fell in love with the way she argued, which was logical and precise and completely fair. She would say, in the middle of a disagreement, "That is a good point, let me reconsider," and then actually reconsider, which was so rare in his experience that it never stopped astonishing him. He fell in love with the way she loved Pearl, which was fierce and intelligent and never indulgent in the soft way, always honest with the child in the way that true love always is. And she loved him in return. He knew this not from declarations. They were both people who used words carefully and not carelessly, but from the evidence of daily life, which is where love actually lives. She brought him coffee in the morning without being asked because she had learned within the first week of marriage that he was not fully awake until the second cup. She read the cattle ledgers he left on the kitchen table and asked questions about them the next morning that were intelligent and specific, because she wanted to understand what he was building and be a part of the understanding. She came to stand beside him sometimes in the evenings when he was on the porch looking at the country going dark to the south, and she did not always speak, but she put her hand in his and stood there, and the standing together was its own complete language. October came again, their first October as a married couple, and with it the particular quality of the Texas autumn that both of them had come to love, that golden, cedar-scented, long-shadowed season that makes the hill country and the country south of the city look like something a painter made up. Pearl turned 8 and was given, by Jeremiah, a pair of proper binoculars for birdwatching, which reduced her to a state of silent reverence that lasted approximately 4 minutes before she ran out into the yard to test them on the mockingbirds in the live oak. Theodora stood beside him on the porch and watched Pearl running with the binoculars raised, turning in circles to bring the various birds into focus, and she leaned against Jeremiah's arm and said, "You know she will now want to become a naturalist." "I know," he said. "That is your doing." "I accept the responsibility," he said. She looked up at him. There was something in her expression that was beyond happiness, a deeper quality, the particular piece of a woman who has been through great difficulty and come out the other side into something good and solid and real. "I am going to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "We are going to have a child," she said. "I have been quite certain for about 3 weeks and I wanted to be sure before I said." He looked at her. Something broke open in him, broke open in the way a seed breaks open in spring. "Theodora," he said. "I know," she said. She was smiling, the full smile, the one that changed everything. "I know." He put his arms around her, right there on the porch with Pearl in the yard inventing new applications for her binoculars, and he held her the way a man holds something he knows is both the most important and the most extraordinary thing in his life. Pearl looked up from the yard and saw them and considered the situation. "Are you two doing that husband and wife thing again?" she asked. "Yes," Theodora said, muffled against his coat. "Is it because there is a baby coming?" Pearl asked. They both looked at her. Pearl lowered the binoculars and met their expressions with composure. "Mrs. Bates told me it was possible," she said. "She said I should be prepared for the eventuality. I am prepared." Jeremiah began to laugh. It was a real laugh, full and warm, and it rolled out across the yard and into the evening air. And Theodora laughed too, and even Pearl, after a moment of considering whether the laughter was at her expense, and concluding it was not, joined in. The winter of 1879 moved with the pleasant weight of waiting. Theodora's pregnancy was steady and uncomplicated, which she attributed to the good air and the absence of the anxiety that had characterized her pregnancy with Pearl, which had happened in a city boarding house while Calvin navigated a business deal that she had known, even then, was risky. Here there was no anxiety. There was only the solid fact of the ranch and her husband and the work of building something, and the particular quality of quiet that a person feels when they are exactly where they are supposed to be. Jeremiah did not hover or fuss. He was attentive and practical. He made sure the kitchen was warm. He drove to the city for the doctor's visits without complaint. He took on the heavier physical work around the property without remark, and without making her feel that she was not contributing. She was contributing enormously, in the 100 ways that the running of a household and a life require, and he saw all of it and said so, not effusively but specifically, which was the way his praise always came and the way she valued it. Pearl went through the winter with a project. She was compiling, in a large blank-paged book she had acquired from the bookshop on one of Mrs. Bates's visits, a complete illustrated guide to the birds of the San Antonio River Valley, hand-drawn and annotated with her own observations, which were precise in their detail and occasionally editorial in a way that made Theodora and Jeremiah both read them, and then each other and then laugh. Spring came as Texas springs come, sudden and extravagant, and scented with bluebonnets and cedar pollen and the green smell of the river rising with the snowmelt from the north. The cattle had come through the winter well, and the first calves of the season were appearing in the pasture with the uncertain, earnest energy of new animals finding their legs. In March of 1880, a boy was born. He came in the night, with the doctor from the city present and Pearl asleep in her room and Jeremiah in the parlor doing the thing that men do in that particular extremity of waiting, which is to occupy themselves with any available task to avoid standing directly in front of the fact that the person they love most in the world is in difficulty, and there is nothing they can do about it. He had repaired a piece of tack, cleaned his rifle, organized the kitchen shelves, and read the same page of a newspaper 14 times before the doctor came out of the bedroom and told him he had a son. He went in. Theodora was pale and sweaty and exhausted and entirely beautiful in the way that people are when they have just done something enormous, and she was holding the baby with the ease and completeness of a woman holding something she already knows. The baby was red-faced and indignant and very new and completely perfect. Jeremiah sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son. Theodora looked up at him, and her eyes were full of everything tiredness and love and triumph and the specific tenderness that comes with new life. "He is all right," Jeremiah said to the doctor. "He is very much all right," the doctor said, "strong and healthy." Jeremiah reached out and touched the baby's face with one careful finger. The baby turned toward the touch with the blind, seeking instinct of the very new, and something in Jeremiah's chest expanded beyond any dimension he had known it to possess. "What do we name him?" Theodora asked. He had thought about it. He had thought about it for months. "Thomas," he said, "if you are willing." She looked at him steadily. Thomas for his father. The man who had borrowed money honestly and given away his photograph, and left a promise that his son had kept. A promise that had set in motion, in the indirect and generous way that some things work, everything that had brought them to this moment. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." In the morning, when the sun came up over the eastern hills and came through the window of Pearl's room and through the window of the bedroom, and lay in long, warm bands across the floor. Pearl came quietly into the room in her nightgown with her hair in a braid and her binoculars around her neck, which she wore as a matter of principle, and stood at the bedside and looked at her brother with an expression of extreme scientific interest. "He is smaller than I expected," she said. "He was just born," Theodora said. "I know, but the books say newborns are approximately this size, and I thought the books were exaggerating downward. They were not exaggerating. He is precisely this size." "His name is Thomas," Jeremiah said. Pearl considered this. "Thomas Chandler," she said, trying it. "That is a good name. It sounds like the name of someone who will be reliable." She reached out and touched the baby's hand with one careful finger, the same gesture Jeremiah had made the night before, and Thomas, with the same blind seeking instinct, turned toward it. Pearl looked up with an expression that was, for all its effort to remain scientific, completely undone. "I think he will do," she said softly. By the summer of 1880, the property south of San Antonio had become, in every meaningful sense, a home. The herd was healthy and growing. The market was good, and Jeremiah's reputation in the San Antonio cattle community was the reputation he had worked toward: honest, capable, fair in a world where fairness was not universal. He had hired 2 permanent hands, a young man named Rodrigo who had grown up working cattle in the coastal plain and knew the business with native precision, and an older man named Ezra who was taciturn and absolutely reliable and could read weather better than anyone Jeremiah had ever met, which in cattle country is the same as saying he was invaluable. Theodora had, in the course of that year, quietly become indispensable to the network of women in the surrounding area, the ranching wives and the farming wives, and the women in the small settlements along the river who had less access to resources than the city women, and who had a harder life as a consequence. She organized, with the determined and practical energy that she brought to all things she decided mattered, a library rotation that circulated books among 6 families whose children had no school within a reasonable distance. She taught reading to 2 of the women in the surrounding area who had not had the opportunity to learn, sitting with them at the kitchen table on Tuesday afternoons with Pearl's old primers and the patient, steady attentiveness that made her good at everything she turned herself toward. She also, on a cold afternoon in November of 1880, told Jeremiah that Thomas would have a sibling. He looked up from the ledger he was writing in and looked at her across the kitchen table. She was smiling the smile. "Again." He said. "Again," she said. "Are you objecting?" "I am not objecting," he said. He closed the ledger. He got up and went around the table and kissed her in the middle of the kitchen, unhurried and thorough, and she laughed against his mouth. From the yard, Rodrigo could be heard talking to the cattle. From the parlor, Pearl could be heard reading Thomas a story, her voice doing different voices for the different characters with theatrical commitment. Thomas, at 9 months old, was the best audience Pearl had ever had, entirely riveted by her performances and vocal in his appreciation. That winter was mild. Thomas took his first steps on a December morning, launching himself from the edge of the settle toward Jeremiah's outstretched hands with the fierce and total commitment of a small person who has decided that walking is the next thing, and is not going to let anything as irrelevant as uncertainty stop him. He made it 4 steps and then sat down hard on the kitchen floor and looked up at his father with an expression of bewilderment and then pride. Pearl, who had witnessed this from the doorway, burst into applause. The second child was born in the summer of 1881 in June, when the bluebonnets were gone, but the Indian paintbrush was still going along the creek banks, and the evening smelled of cedar and warm grass. A girl this time, small and serious and dark-haired, who looked from her first hour like someone who intended to have opinions about things. Pearl named her. Or rather, Pearl presented a formal case for the name she thought appropriate, which was Alina, and her reasons were as follows. 1. It was a strong name. 2. It was the name in the story she had most recently been reading to Thomas. 3. Alina Thomas Chandler had an excellent rhythm when said aloud. And 4. The baby's expression already looked like an Alina. Theodora and Jeremiah looked at each other over Pearl's head and agreed that Alina was a fine name. Mrs. Bates came out from the city for the birth and stayed 2 weeks, which was enough time to teach Pearl 3 new biscuit varieties, make Thomas a knitted hat of considerable complexity, and have the long, warm, comfortable conversations with Theodora that the 2 women had been having since the boarding house on Soledad Street. Conversations that moved through the full range of life and never ran out of things to say. On the last evening of Mrs. Bates's visit, when the children were asleep and Jeremiah had stepped out to check the horses, Theodora and Mrs. Bates sat on the porch together in the warm June night with the sounds of the property around them, the horses, the cattle, the crickets beginning their night chorus, the mockingbirds in the live oak doing their last performance of the day. "You are happy," Mrs. Bates said. It was not a question. "I am," Theodora said. It came out simply, without qualification or caveat, which was itself its own kind of extraordinary for a woman who had learned to hold her happiness lightly because she had seen it taken. "I am glad of it," Mrs. Bates said. "I am very glad of it." Jeremiah came back up the porch steps and settled into the chair on the other side of Theodora, and looked out at the dark with the satisfied ease of a man at home. Theodora reached over and put her hand in his without looking at him, and he closed his hand around hers, and Mrs. Bates watched them with the fond and knowing look of a woman who has spent decades reading people and knows exactly what she is looking at. The years that followed built on themselves with the generous and steady pace of a life well constructed. The ranch grew to 400 acres by 1884, when Jeremiah bought the adjacent parcel from a man named Fisk, who was retiring to San Antonio. The herd grew correspondingly, and Rodrigo became a partner of sorts in the management of the southern pastures, and Ezra read the weather through 3 more winters with perfect accuracy and would not hear of retiring despite being, as far as anyone could determine, at least 65 years old. Pearl grew with the concentrated intensity that had characterized her from the first, becoming at 12, 13, 14 a young woman of formidable intelligence, who had filled 14 volumes of her natural history journals, and who corresponded by letter with a professor of natural sciences at the University of Texas who had read, with some astonishment, a paper she had submitted to the Texas Natural Sciences Society about the nesting behavior of the vermilion flycatcher in the San Antonio River Valley. The professor had written back to inquire whether Mr. Pearl Chandler might be available to contribute further observations. Theodora had written a reply that began, "My stepdaughter, Miss Pearl Chandler, age 13, thanks you for your inquiry." Thomas was, by 4 and 5 and 6, everything Jeremiah had privately hoped for in a son without ever allowing himself to articulate the hope, because a man who is grateful for what he has does not push his luck by wanting specific additions. He was a strong, good-natured child with his mother's dark auburn hair and his father's gray eyes, who learned to ride at 4 on a small dun pony named Biscuit that Pearl had named, and would have been offended to know the name of if she had been paying less attention to her notebooks. He loved the cattle with the practical affection of a child who has grown up watching cattle be the central enterprise of his household, and he followed Rodrigo around the property with the devotion of an apprentice, absorbing everything. Alina was, as her first hour had predicted, a person of opinions. She was also, as the same first hour had not quite predicted, one of the funniest people Jeremiah had ever met. She delivered her observations with the timing and deadpan of a natural comedian, and had been making the adults in her life laugh genuinely since she was 2 years old. She was also, beneath the comedy, a deeply serious person who felt things with the intensity that both her parents recognized and understood and valued. By 1885, when Thomas was 5 and Alina was 4 and Pearl was 14, and had recently received an invitation to present her naturalist observations at a meeting in Austin that Theodora and Jeremiah drove her to in the ranch wagon with considerable pride and some unspoken awe. The Chandler Ranch south of San Antonio was a place of such evident life and richness that the people who came to it, the neighboring families, Mrs. Bates on her regular visits, Moss the cattle buyer who had become a genuine friend, the various people who had business with Jeremiah's operation always left it feeling, in some way they could not always specify, better than when they arrived. Jeremiah stood on the porch on an October evening, the same month in which, 7 years ago, a woman in black had ridden into his auction yard in Dusty Creek with a photograph of his father and changed the entire direction of his life. He was 41 years old. His hair had some gray in it now at the temples, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes from years of looking into the Texas sun. His hands were still the hands of a working man, calloused and strong, and he looked at those hands sometimes and thought about his father's hands, which had looked the same. The photograph of Thomas Chandler was back on a mantelpiece. He had tracked it down through the man from the Fredericksburg consortium who had bought the ranch, who had found the photograph still sitting on the empty mantelpiece when he moved in, and had kept it without knowing whose it was. When Jeremiah had explained its history, the loan, the promissory note, the woman who had ridden 4 days through hill country with a right and a piece of paper, the man had handed it over without a moment's hesitation and said it clearly belonged with the family. It sat now on the mantelpiece of the ranch house south of San Antonio. Thomas Chandler, square-jawed and serious and slightly warm in the eyes, looking out at the parlor where his son had built a family, and his son's wife read books in the lamplight, and his granddaughter annotated birds and his grandsons learned to ride, and his granddaughter watched everything with large dark eyes and said things that made grown people laugh. Theodora came out onto the porch and stood beside him with 2 cups of coffee, handing him one with the ease of 7 years of the same gesture. She had lines at the corners of her eyes too now, from the sun and the laughter, and her auburn hair had a few threads of silver at the temples that she had noticed one morning with equanimity, and he had noticed the same morning with the private thought that she was more beautiful at 35 than she had been at 28, which was already considerable. "Pearl's letter came today," Theodora said. "From Austin. The professor wants her to contribute to his next publication." "She will," Jeremiah said. "Unquestionably," Theodora agreed. "I have already begun drafting the letter of permission." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, the familiar weight and warmth of 7 years of evenings on various porches, and they looked out at the property together, the cattle visible at the far end of the pasture, the live oaks black against the evening sky, the creek catching the last light in the south. "Do you remember," she said, "when you stopped the auction?" "I do," he said. "I thought you were going to tell me the note was invalid," she said. "I had my arguments ready. I was prepared to stand there and make my case for as long as it took." "I know," he said. "I could see you were prepared for a fight." "And then you just stopped everything," she said, "and said to come inside." "You had the right of it," he said, "same as I told you then." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the evening. "I have thought about that a great many times since," she said. "About what would have happened if you had not stopped the bidding, if you had looked at the note and said it was a matter for lawyers and walked away." She paused. "I would have been $372 richer and gone back to San Antonio, and that would have been the end of it." "Yes," he said. "Instead you stopped everything and said come inside," she said, "because of your father's word." "Because of my father's word," he agreed. "And because you walked across that yard the way you walked across it, and I was not going to let that be the end of it." She looked up at him. The evening light was in her eyes, and her expression was the steady, warm, fully open one that she kept for him, and for the children, and for very few others, the expression that she had been slowly revealing to him over the years like a landscape that reveals itself as you travel deeper into it. "Good," she said. He kissed her temple, and she turned into the kiss slightly, and in the pasture the cattle moved against the evening light, and from inside the house came the sound of Pearl's voice reading to Thomas and Eleanor, doing all the voices, the story rising and falling in the warm interior dark. Thomas Chandler's photograph was on the mantelpiece inside, watching all of it, as permanent and steady as the limestone bluffs of the hill country he had loved, as certain as the debt his son had honored and the conversation that honor had begun, and the life that conversation had grown into, branching and flowering outward from a single moment of a man choosing to stop everything and say, "Come inside, we will talk this through properly." That is how it started. That is how it continued. That is how it stayed warm and full and solid and true, in the manner of things that are built on honest foundations by people who have the good sense to recognize what they are standing in front of and the courage to say so. Outside, the mockingbirds in the live oak were doing their late performance, cycling through their catalog of borrowed songs, making from all the sounds they had gathered something entirely their own. The river moved in the south. The cattle settled for the night. The stars came out over Texas in their ancient, unhurried way, and on the porch of the Chandler Ranch, Jeremiah and Theodora stood together in the dark and the warmth and the good, certain quiet of a life that had come, through grace and hard work and the keeping of promises, to exactly this.